we can start. I wanted to introduce Dr. Shelly Volsche. She's a new faculty member in the Department of Anthropology and also in EEB, in the EEB program, bringing a biocultural approach to studying human-animal relationships and evolutionary novelties. She received her PhD from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she studied the application of parenting strategies to pets and the choice to remain child-free. Her background in dog training and behavior combined with a love of evolutionary cognition, helping her build connections in the study of humans and other animals. Dr. Volsche is interested in applying the One Health perspective to emotional and behavioral health, while also considering the ecology and evolution of the human-canine bond. It's from this perspective of humans as animals that today's talk arises, and I'm really excited to hear it and to learn more about your research. Thank you so much for giving a seminar. And also thanks to everyone who is joining. We'll have our last talk of the EEB seminar series on Zoom next week.
Okay.
For this semester.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm actually really excited to give this talk. I've been having a lot of these types of conversations recently since we're all online. Many of my colleagues at other universities that we would often have conversations in passing by email are turning into Zoom chats, which has been kind of nice. So today I'm talking about using animal behavior techniques to study human-animal relationships. Just to get started, a little bit about me. So as mentioned in the intro, I have a background in dog training. And there was a time period where I was a certified dog trainer from the Certification Council for Pet Dog Trainers. And during that time, I also taught preparatory classes online for individuals who wanted to take that certification test. Part of that required an extensive knowledge both of canine ethology and behavior, but also understanding the use of different learning mechanisms, understanding operant conditioning, understanding classical conditioning, and then also understanding how some of the innate behaviors or evolved cognitive traits can actually override our attempts to do those trainings. My background, I actually grew up on a small hobby farm in Marshall, Wisconsin. I often make the joke that there were more cows in my town than people at the time I was there. But then as I reached adulthood, I started gravitating more and more into urban spaces. And I think that this has also given me a unique perspective because of the fact that I spend so much time growing up sitting back and watching other species and wondering things like, why do they do that? Why don't we do that? Why can't we do that? It might be easier, those kinds of things. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and then my MA PhD in anthropology. And as a subdiscipline, I would call myself an anthrozoologist. So that's a very cross-disciplinary term for people who study human-animal interactions. And it can range from the biological processes. You may have seen papers that have come out regarding oxytocin and various other bonding hormones between humans and their pets. But it can also get into some of the behavioral. And while my personal target species is dogs, because that's what I grew up spending the most time with, and that's really what I love, I do look at ways of applying some of these research strategies to other species. I'm working with an undergraduate who just found out yesterday she's getting a Herc Fellowship for the fall, so good for her. But she's looking at human attachment and behavior around the keeping of reptiles, particularly geckos. So there's always new places to study how we interact with others. My research questions, just to draw your attention, this little nugget on the left-hand side of your screen, that is my dog Lucy. She's much older than that picture now, but she's one of those animals who brought me back to school. So how do culture and evolution shape or reshape our relationships with companion animals? And a lot of times when I look at culture, I'm really looking at it as a behavioral adaptation that we have really kind of mastered the use of. And in that vein, then I also see culture in other species, a lot of very Franz de Waal, Jane Goodall type of approaches taking place. Does our knowledge of other species capacities change the way we view and use them? And if so, how? If we understand more about the cognitive and emotional lives of certain livestock, how would that potentially change the way we keep them, whether or not they remain food, those types of things? And then also, what is or was the ecology of the human-canine coevolution? And I really pay close attention to a lot of those domestication papers as people play tug of war with who domesticated whom and how did we come to this beautiful relationship after 15,000 or more years. So I'm just going to start with this image that as EEB graduate students, all of you know in some variation, right, the scientific method. And with this idea, you know, we start with a question, we do our background research, we construct our hypotheses, we do all these things in the effort of remaining really clear and objective about what it is we're trying to do. But one of the challenges I often face and consider on my own work or when working with students is, what if the perspective of your question is biased, right? What if you're making assumptions about the other species or the other person or the other interaction that is maybe not quite accurate? And the problem with that is that you can have consequences all the way down through your scientific method, because as soon as your question is coming from a potentially biased perspective, and it's basically impossible to get rid of all bias, but being conscious of it, that will change where you read, what journals you look at, what keywords you use when doing your literature review, and those types of things. And my experience with that is that it tends to create these challenges that we face. A lot of times when our target species or our emphasis is studying humans, we lean towards asking and we rely on verbal language. And I find it surprising that in a lot of research, particularly on adults, we tend to rely less on behavior than I think that we could. Remembering that we are still behaving animals above and, you know, before we have this verbal language. So much research on humans ends up using interviews, ends up using interactions and casual conversations, ends up using surveys and these types of things. And so I think that if we stepped back and could observe ourselves as just an animal once in a while, we may learn some interesting new things about ourselves, particularly in ecological context, conservation context. And then when we study animals, we tend to go to the other extreme. We assume there's no language, right? Behaviorism in the 60s really pushed back, saying it's a black box, we can't know what the other animal's thinking, they can't tell us, therefore we shouldn't even think about cognition. And this idea of anthropomorphism being this dirty word. And over the last decade or so, a lot of people have stepped forward and kind of saying anthropomorphism is a tool like any other tool. And you can use it in positive and good ways. You can use it as a way of making guesses and assumptions that you can then try to test. And yes, you can still also assume that your dog is capable of spite, which, you know, Alexander Horowitz's research shows that they may not be able to. And so one book that I recommend anytime someone is interested in like cognitive and emotional health, especially that One Health perspective, is Animal Madness by Laurel Braitman. She's got a great TED Talk. The book is fantastic. She has her PhD in biology from MIT. And so she used to come from this black box perspective. We can only look at behaviors and functionality. We can't really make any cognitive or emotional assumptions. Anthropomorphism is bad. And then she adopted a dog who had severe separation anxiety. And she found herself on this journey that took her to Thailand to look at elephants and took her to all these different places where she started to realize that a lot of the emotional and mental disorders that we see in humans, anxiety and self-harm, we see in other species, and they come from very similar places. And so sometimes anthropomorphism can be a really good tool when we're trying to understand something like the evolutionary purpose of anxiety or where it came from. So with this toolbox, we can use surveys, but that again is relying on language. We can do participant observations. And these are things that we can do both by going and hanging out with people in their environments, but we can also do it by going to a dog park or going to one of the parks downtown and just sitting and being part of the space, not necessarily, you know, take off our human hat and just watch what our squirrels doing, watch what the birds doing. And being in the EEB program, I'm willing to bet many of you listening to this are in that space. You are that person who likes to just watch and see what happens and make educated guesses, right? You can use scan sampling. You can use focal follows. We have functional analysis, ad libitum observations, formal ethograms. And I have a note here about anecdotes, which I'll get to in a second. So we have all these different toolkits tool items that are really from animal behavior in a lot of cases being applied into human research, and then we can apply them back. So I taught a honors seminar back at UNLV, and I showed these two pictures to the students, and I said, which one of these pictures was made by, which one of these rock piles was made by humans and which was made by chimpanzees? And there were a lot of guesses and a lot of different reasons behind why they thought one or the other. Ultimately, the one on the left that is in the tree is actually made by chimpanzees. And the paper that came out from this observation originally said this looks like it may be almost ritual behavior because it tended to be specific trees for specific troops, specific types of rocks being stored there. And of course, you look at this and you say, well, it looks like there's just a pile of rocks. Maybe they're just caching tools, right? But then another photo from the same paper had this image where the rocks seem to be stacked very particularly within the tree. And this is where anecdotes can sometimes become a toolbox item, because we can look at this, and before we would say that there's nothing, no form of ritual behavior among chimpanzees until we saw this, right? When it came to kind of like territorial warfare between chimpanzees troops, we used to think that there was no such thing, and then Jane Goodall saw it, and oh, okay, well, chimpanzees can actually be much more aggressive than we thought. That changed the way a lot of primatology was done. Bonobos, we always thought they were just the lovers, and in reality they can actually be fairly aggressive, usually in a more ritualized way. It's not, it's often not in a physical aggression, although it can be. So this kind of idea that sometimes it's an analogy that was used to me once was it's the purple polar bear that proves they're not all white. Sometimes an anecdote is a place to start for more formal research. And that's why I like this quote by Mark Bekoff: the plural of anecdote is data. And just like any other tool, this mindset shouldn't be taken too far to say that every just so story is a starting point. But there are some things that if we see repeatedly certain types of behavior, don't necessarily discount them. They could spark a more formal type of research study. So with canids, we've always thought of theory of mind having to be visual. Right? So we do the self-recognition test in the mirror, where we put some sort of dot on a child's forehead, or we put a piece of, like a stroke of paint on a chimpanzee's head, or we put a Post-it note somewhere on an animal's body. And there are quite a few animals who have actually passed the self-recognition test, but canids never did. And one day, Alexander Horowitz and Mark Bekoff and a few other people started studies because they thought, well, dogs aren't visual. So maybe they don't care if they see themselves in a mirror. And what they did is they ended up actually putting out samples of urine marking, and they would put the dog's own urine in the samples along with other dogs. And what they found is they spent significantly less time smelling their own urine. It was almost as though they stopped and went, oh yeah, that's me, and then were more curious about what else was being. And I liken this to scrolling Twitter or something where you're like, oh yeah, I saw that post already. Right? You don't spend as much time investigating it because it's not new anymore. So how do we think about combining these approaches, right? Well, one of the things is I step back and I say humans are animals, right? And it's kind of funny to me that how frequently that many of us in various forms of research, both the social and the natural sciences, forget this simple fact. And realistically, there's a lot of evidence that non-human animals have language as well. There's quite a bit in non-human animals in body language, in vocalizations, in different types of smell marking, and different ways of leaving certain things like scat, right? How are they leaving scat to mark territories as well as urine, all these different things, but also more and more animals we're finding have very similar language processing capabilities to humans. They process sounds and emotional overtone separately, much like we do. That's why your dog knows the difference between calling them because you have like a really tasty treat and you want them to come running, and calling them to get a bath. And usually there's something in our vocalization that sounds different, and that's why when you get really angry and you're screaming come and your dog isn't listening to you because the voice is saying don't come anywhere near me, I'm dangerous right now, even though the cue that you're delivering is saying come here. But we can use this kind of to look at how both ends of the leash communicate. Both dogs and humans, dogs and cats, dogs and horses, whatever, I'm sorry, humans and cats, humans and horses, whatever species you're watching, there's communication going on and the capability of, through ontogeny, developing the ability to understand each other. And so I think that this has a role to play when we think about all the videos we see of, cross-species friendship and different things. And especially then when it comes to us. So this photo here that you see, this is a Las Vegas dog park. And this is where I started with the idea of, can we combine these methods? And if so, how? What would that look like? If we stopped talking to people and tried to observe their interactions with other species from a behavioral angle, right? Thinking about what the vocalizations are, thinking about what the body language says, thinking about, well, most humans don't walk around scent marking in the dog park, but sometimes the dogs will do that in response to something that the person is doing. So can we use these techniques to study human-animal relationships? Can we consider humans as ecological beings within this space and use these methods, the scan samplings and the focal follows? And that was kind of what started this whole idea for me. So this paper, good timing, it was just accepted into Anthrozoos about a week ago. And so this is a paper by myself and a handful of undergraduate and one graduate student at UNLV. And it was really just a proof of concept. So you'll notice that our number of focal follows is fairly small. We didn't want to scale this up to something with, trying to get 22,000 or 2,800 samples until we knew that we could actually do this. And so we used the worksheet that you see on the left-hand side of your screen to really kind of track what park type we were visiting. Was it a leashed park? Was it an off-leashed park? Interestingly enough, the students that were working with me felt most comfortable at off-leash parks because of the fact that they could be outside of the gates and not have to worry about interacting with the dogs or potentially being in a dangerous situation if a fight were to break out. So that did end up being something where we didn't get as even a sample as we had wanted to. But then we looked at age groups, and this was really done the way that you would probably do it with a chimpanzee, like how wrinkled, is there a lot of gray, how mobile do they seem moving. It was really more about the ways that they dressed and carried themselves and some of those physical markers, because we were not going to be talking to them and collecting their ages, but trying to get a feel for, can we, fairly accurately make these guesses. Same thing with gender, which we have since changed to sex. I'm not going to get into the sex and gender discussion today because there's how you use the terms. There's a lot of opinions in both directions. I was using gender because it's based on what we're seeing performed, but a valid point was made that we were also using secondary sex characteristics like the presence of beards and things like that. But so we did our best with male and female, and I made a point of making sure that there was uncertain, so that if a student was starting a focal follow and they were just not sure, the persons appeared non-binary, those types of things, that they could make that choice. And surprisingly, there were a very small amount. There was only about 6 cases where it wasn't fairly obvious to them the gender of the owner. We did our best with sex of dog. Lifting the skirt of a dog in the public park is pretty tricky, especially if you're near the small dogs. And so that ended up not really yielding any really solid results. We looked at things like whether or not the dog was leashed in an off-leash park, which is dangerous for many reasons I can get into in questions if you want. But then also whether or not they were off-leash in parks that are supposed to be leashed. And so we had a hypothesis that because of kind of signaling and displays among men, that they may be more likely to have their dog off leash in a leashed park. That ended up not really developing into anything either. And then the start time, stop time, so we could be certain that the focal follow was a full 10 minutes. The date, the day of the week, we were watching, whether or not things vary depending on who was at the park at certain times. We had other notes, quite a few cell phones. If if when I replicate this study, I'm definitely counting cell phone use. We had a lot of individuals who were pulling out their cell phones. Either on occasion they were checking the time or taking photos, but there were a few cases where they would let the dog loose into the dog run and then sit down and be on their phone the entire time. And there was some very interesting disconnected behavior between them and the dog. The dog would bring them the toy, a ball or something, and they would kind of kick the ball, but not actually interact with their dog much. And it played out in things like whether or not the dog came when called. And then these 14 behaviors you see at the bottom, we were very specifically counting the frequency that they occurred. So each time that a behavior or an interaction was initiated, we would put down a hash mark. And if the behavior was continued over about a 30-second time period, because most of the students were actually using their cell phone timers, right? Not just checking the time, but actually using the stopwatch. So pets dog on the head, calls dog, hugs, kisses the dog, baby talks to the dog, throws toy, plays with dog, gives dog food, treats, speaks gently or whispers to the dog, and then pets dog on rear, dogs come when called, scolds, speaks harshly to the dog, hits, spanks dog on the rear, hits dog on shoulder or head, collar, correction, or leash jerk, and leashes dogs. And before, because not all of these students had any canine ethology training at all, so before they actually started doing data collection on their own, we spent time sitting at the park and observing, and me explaining things they were seeing and discussing the difference between petting the dog on the rear and spanking them. What does that really look like? Breaking down behaviors, you know, when is a dog coming when called and when aren't they? Are they having an immediate recall, or are they kind of acknowledging that they're being called but not running over? We had some instances where the dog was called multiple times and then it would just kind of slink over to the owner instead of actually coming when called. So we had to have those kinds of training. So on some level, the dog training knowledge that I had built up over years of doing it professionally really helped me in training and helping these students learn what they're looking at. So we ended up with a population of 177 complete follows. We had some that were just not complete. We had some where they would start watching the follow, and at about 5 or 6 minutes, the owner would take the dog out of the run, so they'd have to stop. There were a couple of instances where people approached the research assistant and they let them know, yes, we're doing a research study. This is what we're doing. We had an exempt handout to give them if they had any questions, that they could contact me as the PI. But then also, all of the research assistants were informed that instructed that if you in fact are approached by one of the people you're observing, you need to stop doing that follow, because they're now aware. And the purpose of trying to do this was to see if we could observe human-canine interactions in a situation where it's a fairly natural space to be spending time together at the park. Don't want to get going on the IRB nightmare if we were to try to put cameras in people's homes and get a true natural interaction. But as soon as they're aware, there's a chance for a performance bias, and so we had to rule out any of that. We did a pretty good job of getting a balance between male and female, so we had 87 men and 84 women. And then our age cohort, I think they did a pretty good job of getting a nice range. 58 young adults, 70 middle age. And of course I said to them, I said, if they look like they're about my age, because I'm 43, I was 42 at the time, or 41 at the time, I said, if they look about my age, then they're probably middle adult. Like if they look like your parents, and then elderly adult, we were really focusing on things like, you know, how was their mobility? Did they seem to have wrinkles? Did the skin seem kind of weathered? And in Vegas in particular, there's so much sun exposure, gray hair, those types of things. So what we found is actually well supported by a lot of the research, and our hypotheses to some extent really kind of held true. Women were more likely to baby talk to their dog, and they were more likely to speak gently or whisper to their dog. Now you'll notice the p-values. I do have a note here. There's a debate about the idea of p-values as trending or a hard line in the sand. And because of our small sample size, we really wrote this up understanding that yes, we're a little over the P05 on some of these, but with the understanding that previous literature in a more controlled setting has found similar effects, and also that this makes evolutionary sense that we would see these differences. And this makes sense in light of other sex differences that have been in other research. And I'll get to that in a minute with some of the citations there. So women were more likely to baby talk to dog and speak gently, whisper to dog. Young adults were more likely to use collar corrections or leash jerks. And I think this really has to do with kind of that sense of judgment, being observed, wanting the dog to behave well. We see this sometimes with young parents where they're really sensitive to how others are viewing their parenting based upon the child's behavior. And so sometimes that leads to a stronger tendency to be a little bit rougher. We didn't really see any heavy, like full-on abuse. There were no situations where the dog was being mistreated in a way that anybody felt it was appropriate or necessary to call any sort of animal control. And that was something that I had told students, like, if this occurs, let me know. And they all had my cell phone number so they could actually text me in the moment if anything came up. We also found that young adults were trending towards, well, not quite far enough to really hold on to it, but that they were more likely to be playing with their dogs, throwing the ball, playing chase, roughhousing. And the thing that's really interesting here is that there was no sex difference in this space. Both young men and young women were more likely to be engaging very hands-on with their dogs at the park, whereas some of the elderly adults were observed having time walking around. That they would walk and the dogs would follow them, or they would be having their coffee, kind of a coffee clutch thing while the dogs were playing. But those younger adults seem to really kind of be hands-on with their dogs. And that matches some of the anecdotes that were shared with me from the research team kind of after the fact or outside of the actual recorded follows. So that's one of the surprises really in this paper, is how much both men and women were playing with their dogs. I think that may very well translate to or come from a place of who's going to get a dog versus a cat, right? The desire to have something with whom you can play. But also, this is clearly a self-selected population, because we're already talking about dog owners who are sufficiently invested that they're going to the park with their dog. They're not just playing in the backyard and calling that good. They're not just walking around the neighborhood. And so we would, it makes sense then that they're a little more invested in building the relationship when they get to this space. That, interestingly enough, mirrors a lot of what we see in parenting literature, along with the presence of the secure base effect in a lot of these dogs. So people who were playing with their dogs, just like if you go to the park and you have that child who's playing and he kind of keeps looking over his shoulder and make sure mom's over there, and as soon as he realizes mom's not there, he just comes unglued, starts crying, where's my mom, right? Dogs have something very similar. And so we would actually observe and see cases where if the people stopped playing with the dog would be very persistent, become incredibly clingy, needing to be close and having that attention. One thing that we did not record that wasn't observed in the focal follows, although there were a lot of anecdotes about it, is there was less dominance display from men than we expected. We really expected more of that man with the dog off leash at the leash park. We expected more of the man kind of controlling the way the dog behaves, grabbing the dog by the leash, yelling at the dog if it's misbehaving, showing off how well trained their dog was by calling them out of situations. And that wasn't recorded in the focal follows nearly as much. However, a lot of anecdotes, specifically for young adult men, of spending time outside of off-leash dog runs with the dog off-leash performing. Right? And so there were a lot of instances where, and we would expect this from evolutionary psychology kind of a perspective, we would expect that kind of show off, right? We would expect that signaling of, look at how great I am, that I have my dog under all this control. And so we would see them, having dogs performing tricks, climbing up on benches and sitting and waiting while other dogs were coming in and out of the dog runs and these kinds of things. So I think in future projects, being able to have more space to capture those things that are occurring outside of focal follows so that we can really quantify how often that actually happened. And there is some evidence to suggest this might be the case. Blazina and Kogan did a paper on masculinity and dog attachment or attachment to a dog. And they found some similar things as far as needing to play up the masculine side in younger adults, whereas older adult men and elderly men were often much more willing to kind of talk up the softness of their relationship and their reliance on their dog. It's almost like they got too old to care. They love their dog and they're not going to make qualms about it. So going back then, this really does support Archer's 2019 paper about evolutionary sex differences, to the extent that we would expect the primarily heteronormative females, but females in general have an evolutionary bias towards being caring, being direct caregivers. Which doesn't mean that every woman is a caregiver. That's a different talk that I can definitely get into if anybody has questions on it. But this idea that from an evolutionary perspective, women spend the most time having to provide the direct care, the feeding, the grooming, the raising, the teaching, the hands-on daily care, whereas men were more likely to be going out hunting. They would play with and provide leadership and guidance, but maybe not as much with infants. For example, infant holding is significantly higher in female and female kin than it is in males. But again, the Blazina and Kogan 2019 paper where men downplay their attachment to dogs, and where particularly as younger men, there's a stronger bias towards the dog being a display of one's masculinity and capacity to be a good, strong father and caregiver. Those things are still present. And so it makes sense to us there that, well, I shouldn't say it makes sense. We really expected to capture it in the data in the focal follows, rather than just some of the anecdotes. So keeping those things in mind. But then here is a list of some of the prior literature on sex differences of interactions with pet dogs that really made sense and supported what we found. There's a lot of data on women tending to be a little bit more neurotic and kind of obsessive with protecting and caring and loving their pets, whereas and being more using the motherese, like cooing and talking to the baby, talking to the puppy, and kind of really getting engaged with the pet. Whereas with men, there tends to be less verbal soothing and more physical contact. So of course, we're not going to see them whispering to their dog as much. They're not likely to be kissing their dog in the same way that women would be. So ultimately, there's definitely some challenges with the way we ran this study, especially since we were doing it in a fairly short turnaround time. And I acknowledge that, it would be nice if we could find a way to do this same sort of hands-off study, but still do video recordings that could be quantified differently so we have amount of time spent doing these behaviors rather than just individual occurrences of them. I think that if we could get in that way, we would probably see a lot more nuance in some of these interactions. There are definitely other interactions that have come out in more recent research that may be relevant to adding into a study like this. But I think at the end of the day, it's really great that we were able to provide a proof of concept that we can look at these dyadic relationships from a more animal behavior ethology type of perspective and not always having to send out surveys asking owners, what do you think? Take this attachment survey, but rather looking at the interaction as two animals that are negotiating a space together, and what does that look like? So for future projects, definitely would like to repeat this with a larger sample. That would be one of my first targets here, is building, training individuals and having more than a couple of weeks really to try to dive in and train, but really training individuals and being able to go to different parks around Boise, being able to maybe go back to Las Vegas for a summer and do some of the, and do some of the studies there, possibly traveling to other areas within the US so that we can capture some of the regional differences. I think that if we were to repeat something like this in the Southeast versus the Pacific Northwest, we're going to see some very different interactions with this, but in the differences of those interactions and the differences of those training styles, would we see the sex differences still there, right? Evolutionary psychology would tell us yes, but is that really the case? But also to kind of look at this, how it scales up between rural interactions where dogs tend to be more likely sentinels for the home or helpers on the ranch, moving into urban environments where they come in to the yard, sometimes into the home, and then into metro environments where we see more and more people choosing not to have children. They're applying those parenting strategies to their pets. How does that relationship, those three levels of interactions, how does that shape the way that males and females separately or even different age groups are interacting with their dogs? I would also like to love to get into doing this with some free-ranging dog stuff. Still waiting. Hopefully all of the wonderful things going on in our world start to clear away. The possibility of a student joining me from India in the fall who is interested in doing this, looking at human interactions and responses to free-ranging dogs, and then getting into the cross-cultural, right? What does this look like in Mexico City versus Bangalore, India, versus Tokyo, Japan, versus Chicago? How do cultural perspectives of what an animal is for shape these interactions? Can we observe differences in how play styles and whether or not there's hugging and kissing and all these things start to happen? Surveys suggest that it's more about the rural urban metro. We did have a paper come out in last summer looking at India, college students in Bangalore, India, and their perceptions of dogs. What's the purpose of a dog? What kind of dog would you own? Do you own a dog? How do you interact with your dog? And there was a surprising amount of, well, first of all, that particular university, it's a higher level of upper middle class and upper class students. So we've got some socioeconomic things happening there, and that tends to come from being in a metro environment. But interestingly, the willingness to have a local free-ranging dog adopted as a pet and the types of interactions, they're sleeping in the homes more. They are being fed, what the family is eating more frequently. They're getting better quality veterinary care than a lot of the literature would tell us. So we could potentially do this type of observational work and see what are the differences between a free-ranging dog and an owned dog in the same metro space, where the idea of shared social spaces is a very key cultural ideal in that country. And then also I'd love to do this with other species. I think this would be a great to be able to invest in the time to go to different places where people are maybe equine facilities and different types of equine sports or training, or individuals who just own large barns. How do they interact differently? I think that the possibilities are endless once we step back and reframe our perspective on that initial question of our research. Okay, that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, by the way, for listening.
Thanks, Shelly. Yeah, if people have questions, you can just either raise your hand. There's like a little place over on the side under participants tab where you can raise your hand, or you can just start speaking. If you can turn on your videos, sometimes that makes it easier to interact too. I can start with one. I was curious, when you're working with a lot of different students who are taking these observations, do you see any observer bias? Is that something that you look for? And would you need a bigger sample size to be able to see that?
I think I would need a bigger sample size, and that is definitely a limitation of this first project, because it would be nice to be able to do inter-rater reliability, right? Have a video where two different people, both from this perspective of the cleanliness of the data, but also from the perspective of training the students at what they're looking at. So that is definitely something that is on my mind about how to try to do this again in the future, but still preserving that kind of disconnect of not actually engaging the human in the process. So I'm working with Francine, thinking through some ideas, like, how am I going to do this? Can I do this? But yeah. And that's also another thing, but if we were able to do it on a larger scale, we'd be able to take more time. And I think that would also help if, being able to take the time to really train students to see what's a smile, right? A smile, a smile means you're happy. Well, it depends on the type of smile. If we break down a smile, the corners are turned up, but it may not be a sincere smile if the eyes aren't turned up, right? So really breaking down what we see into actual behaviors instead of judgments or assumptions. So yes, I think there was probably at least some observation bias or observer bias in there. And yet we still have that finding of the women with their dogs that I think is probably why this is getting published, even though clearly the methodology needs some work. I see Carl's hand.
Yeah, Carl.
Hi, Shelly. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, hi.
Could you clarify whether your predictions for adult males were not supported or what they were?
So our prediction for adult males, you're meaning as far as the expectation that they would do more display and dominance behavior towards their dogs?
Yeah, I just noticed that you had predictions or observations and p-values for young adults and adult women, but none for men.
Yeah. So our biggest prediction for men, based on prior observations of just being out, right, kind of almost like participant observation, really was that we would see especially young men displaying. We predicted that there would be some form of control display, dominance display, look at how well trained my dog is, I am good mate material display. And it never showed up in the focal follows. A lot of the researchers noted it as anecdotes on the backs of their sheets, like, oh, the same person after I finished following them did this thing. But because it was never within the 10-minute focal follow, we didn't want to count that. For partially because we were trying to, stay as unbiased as possible given the constraints of the project. So we definitely would have expected that, and it wasn't there. And based on the Blazina and Kogan paper, we would have thought it would be, because one of the things they found was that men's awareness of masculinity norms tended to bias the way they behaved as young men much more than the way that they behaved as elderly men, both in their behavior with the dogs, but then also their actual discussion of attachment, saying words like, I love my dog, those types of things. Especially in a large metro area like Las Vegas, where I'll tell you just from my experiences as a dog trainer spending time out, it was very common in that area for men to have their dog off leash and call them over and scold them and tell them that they needed to lay down. That kind of chimpanzee behavior was very common. But it didn't show up in the focal follows. So we were really surprised because we thought it would.
Thanks.
Yeah. You're still muted.
Maybe since we have a little more time, would you tell us also a little bit about some of your other study areas and projects, just so people can get to know your research a little more?
Absolutely. I do a lot of survey work because it's easy. So even though I say, wow, we're biased to language, I fall into that bias like many people. And my questions often come from this kind of evolutionary novelty perspective, and often related to dogs, although not always. So right now, one of the projects I'm working on has to do with the presence of pets in the homes during shelter-in-place orders. I'm doing this with a colleague of mine, actually Elizabeth Johnson, who's one of the co-authors on this paper. And so we're looking at people's perceptions of ostracism and attachment, both with their own or their own human family, but then also their pets, and looking at what are the similarities and differences there, with one of the kind of evolutionary based predictions being that if there's children in the home, that the pet may be getting less attention during this time, because now you're, not just mom, but you're also teacher, right? You're not just dad, you're also math professor or whatever. And so we're kind of looking at that. But then we're also suspecting that people who maybe don't have children or are in their homes alone may really be relying on the pets. So we have two mirrored survey components, instruments, where they're answering the same questions, but with pet and family flipped. I also am working on a project with an undergraduate who is looking at life history factors and the choice not to have children. So it takes a little bit of a left turn in some of my other work, and really looking at whether or not relationships with guardians early in life have any sort of predictive value on whether or not a person chooses to have children. And some of the questions that she's developed for that survey are really unique in the sense that that area of research has often been very sociological, very based on feminism and identity and that type of more social science push, as opposed to thinking about it from this very like life history trade-offs kind of an angle. And there's a survey that I'm working on writing up from a year and a half ago, so when you all graduate, know that you will still be working on things, but looking at similar things regarding health histories and early versus late articulation of when they chose not to have children. And a surprising number of people have very strong memories of being 10, 11 years old and not wanting to hold babies and these kinds of things, but interestingly enough, being very attached to their family pet. So I'm very curious to develop more on how this kind of role of pets as, I don't want to say surrogate children, because most people who parent their pets acknowledge they're not kids, they have different needs. But there is some sort of supplemental relationship that goes on there. But I'm also trying to develop a project with Jared Romero that would look at first responders and whether or not there are benefits to canine assisted interventions for those individuals. So lots going on. I have lots of questions. So if anybody's looking for a project, please contact me because I am always looking for help on my many questions.
Well, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I was interested in the part that you were saying about the shifts with dogs in India and how they're, like, I guess historically they have been like mostly outside dogs, and then now that's transitioning that they're becoming more part of the family, like inside and being taken care of more. And so I was just wondering if that is a generational thing, or do you like a societal thing, or if that makes sense? Because
it does.
Yeah, like my mom, she's from the Philippines, and like they treat dogs, like they're outside, and so like now me, the next generation, I care for my dog, like very closely, like she sleeps with us and everything, and so like, is it a generational thing, you think, or?
I've been putting a lot of thought into this one, and I'm doing more research with the co-authors from India, specifically because we're really curious about how it's happening. So one thing that's really interesting about India is so much of our literature on dogs in India is about how there are disease vectors and rabies and all these different concerns. And so when you try to research dogs in India, what you find in the databases are generally leaning towards that. Now, Dr. Badra has started to do a lot more work on free-ranging dogs as ecological beings in these shared social spaces, and looking at how it's different if they're village dogs in a small village versus free-ranging dogs in an urban environment like Bangalore. One thing that's really interesting, though, is the culture behind India, because of the prevalence, the Hindu background, is the idea of these shared social spaces with other beings is very much at the core of a lot of how they perceive the world, which makes it odd that they had such an agonistic relationship with canines for so long. What we're seeing now is it's not as much in villages. It's definitely in more urban environments, and it's definitely those who have more education, more socioeconomic status. And yes, it does seem to be strongest in younger generations, possibly because we are much more global now. We have access to social media, and so we can share these ideas, and somebody who might have pushed down that inkling that animals have a soul or whatever, right? They now have room to express that and explore that. And so I think that's part of it. The fact that we're seeing co-sleeping generally the trends and the things that actually tie my two kind of seemingly unrelated areas of research, when education rises and women's access to reproductive choice increases and women's status in a culture increases, you start to see fertility decline, and you often see shifts from multi-generational households to conjugal households, right? So a nuclear family. Even if there may still be one or two people, it doesn't tend to be the same, like all the grandparents and grandchildren and everybody's in one space. So we're seeing that starting to happen, that our paper kind of captured that was starting to happen in India. Also, there's a pushback against the colonial British influence of purebred dogs. So more of them are saying, why would I buy a golden retriever when there's this sweet free-ranging dog outside that comes up to me every time I go out to leave food, or approaches me tentatively, yes, for obvious reasons, they're not always treated well, but is willing to come up and investigate and build a potential relationship. And so what does that look like? And so when you have those factors coming together with an increased awareness of animal welfare, veterinary care, if you take care of the free-ranging dogs, they become less of a disease vector. All those types of things are coming together. And so it's definitely a generational shift, although of course you're going to have outliers of older generations. One of the questions we asked during that survey was whether or not you perceived your views of dogs as the same, better, or worse than your parents and your grandparents. And many of them said definitely better than their grandparents. Some of them said the same or better than their parents. Very few said that their perceptions of dogs were any worse. And that was both for pet dogs and stray dogs. Or I'm sorry, yes, pet dogs and free-ranging dogs. So I think that we might see something similar in conversations I've had with individuals in Mexico, where you still have kind of that unowned dog who's just the whole village's dog, right, in a smaller rural setting. But then in Mexico City, I mean, there's doggy daycares in Mexico City, and we would never have thought that would be a thing among the Hispanic culture. So it's very interesting to see how some of these urbanization and demographic shifts kind of bring certain animals into the home.
That's great. Thank you.